The wind moved across the prairie with a lonely whistle, carrying dust and secrets over the wide plains of the Wild West. The sky stretched endlessly, its copper glow at dusk painting the land in shades of fire and shadow. It was a land where men lived by their grit, where law rode slow, but bullets traveled fast, and where women were either cherished as rare flowers or thrown into storms they had never chosen. Out here, nothing was simple. Every glance, every whispered promise, every step into the unknown carried weight. The story began on such a night, when fate pressed two strangers together under circumstances neither had expected nor welcomed, and the land itself seemed to hold its breath. He was a cowboy, hardened by years of dust, saddle leather, and the sharp scent of gunpowder. His life had been nothing but long rides, fleeting towns, and the constant reminder that peace rarely lasted. He carried scars, some on his skin, many more in his heart, and he never lingered anywhere long enough to let someone close enough to heal them. Folks in the frontier towns knew him as a man who never backed down, a figure riding tall under the sun, but when the night came, the loneliness crept in. He had no home to go back to, no family to greet him. Only the endless trail was his companion. He told himself that was enough, though deep down the silence gnawed him. She came from another world entirely, softer, untouched by the dust and danger of this harsh land. Raised with manners, rules, and the quiet rhythm of safety, she had never imagined herself lost on the frontier, yet fate in its wild way had brought her here. She was young, innocent to the darker ways of men and the land they ruled, yet her eyes held a fire that she herself did not yet know existed. That fire was what caught his attention the moment their paths crossed. There was something about her, something unbroken, something that made the cowboy's rough edges pause, even when his instincts told him to ride on and leave her behind. The land had a way of twisting stories into legends. Whispers traveled faster than the wind, and the whispers that followed these two would soon shape a tale that none could forget. On the night she fell asleep against his chest, a storm was building, not just in the sky, but in the very fabric of their lives. She had not chosen him, and he had not asked for her. Yet circumstances stronger than either of them bound them together. The world of the Wild West had little room for choices when survival was at stake, and even less patience for innocence. The town that looked on saw not two strangers thrown together by chance, but a union they would not let slip away. That night, the air was thick with tension. The fire cracked low, shadows stretching across the ground like restless spirits. She trembled, uncertain whether it was fear or exhaustion that made her body lean against him, her cheek resting where his heartbeat thudded steady and unyielding. He stared into the darkness, jaw tight, knowing what this closeness would mean when the dawn came. Out here, appearances ruled. A woman in the arms of a man was no matter to be explained away with words. The West was unforgiving, its judgment swift. By the time the morning light touched the prairie, the world would see her as his bride, but not a willing one. He had not spoken of marriage, nor had she dreamed of it. Yet the line between honor and ruin in the frontier was as sharp as a knife's edge. The townsfolk were already watching, their whispers carried by curiosity and suspicion. A girl unprotected, a cowboy unanchored, it was enough for rumors to root deep and grow wild. For her, the thought was unbearable. Its marriage to a man she barely knew, tied to a life she had never wanted, bound to the hardships of a cowboy's world. For him, it was a chain he had never asked to wear. He had built his life on freedom, on never belonging to anyone but the trail and the wide open sky. And yet here they were, on the edge of a fate neither could escape. The prairie seemed to listen, as though the land itself knew the weight of what was unfolding. The coyote's cry in the distance cut sharp through the silence, a reminder of how close danger always was. She stirred at the sound, clutching at his shirt in her half-sleep. And he felt something stir inside him, something unfamiliar and unwelcome. Protection, responsibility, and beneath it, a quiet ache he had buried for years. He told himself it was nothing, just the duty of a man to guard a woman alone in this harsh land. Yet when he looked down at her, he could not deny that something had already shifted. What he feared most was not the judgment of others, but the storm rising inside him. By dawn, the fire had burned to ash. She woke slowly, confusion flickering in her eyes as the morning sun revealed her position, pressed against him in a way that left no question to any who might see. Her breath caught, realization dawning even before he spoke. He looked away, jaw set, already hearing the whispers that would greet them in town. Her innocence, her very reputation, had been placed in his keeping, and in the West, that meant only one thing: marriage, whether she wished it or not. Her heart pounded as she pulled back, the world suddenly closing in around her. She wanted to cry out, to deny what the night had made of her. She wanted to tell him this was a mistake, that she could not, would not, be bound to him. But the weight of his silence pressed heavier than words. His eyes, shadowed with conflict, told her the truth she dreaded. He did not want this either. And yet the land they lived on did not care for what hearts wanted. It cared only for survival, for reputation, for the rules of honor that men and women alike were forced to obey. The day stretched before them like a gallows rope, each step toward the town a step closer to a fate sealed by whispers and traditions older than either of them. She walked beside him, her body stiff, her mind racing. He rode with shoulders tense, every line of him caught between resistance and resignation. Neither spoke of what awaited them, but the silence between them was louder than any gunshot. The question of choice, of freedom, of love itself, hung heavy in the air, waiting to be answered in ways that would scar them both. And so their story began, not with vows spoken by choice, not with the gentle weaving of love, but with a storm of circumstance that neither could escape. She, the virgin who had only sought safety, found herself bound against her will. He, the cowboy who had only ever sought freedom, found himself tied to a life he had never planned. And in the Wild West, where bullets and rumors carried the same deadly weight, the path ahead promised nothing but fire, dust, and the clash of two hearts caught in a trap they had never built. What they did not yet know was that this unwilling bond would be tested in ways that neither law nor tradition could decide. For now, as the town's church bell rang faint in the distance, their fates tightened like the noose of a rope. The question lingered in the air: would this union break them or shape them into something stronger than either dared imagine? The answer waited just beyond the horizon. The trail into town stretched long beneath the morning sun, the horizon a wavering line of heat and dust. He rode silent, reins loose in his weathered hands, yet every muscle in his body seemed to fight the road ahead. She walked just behind his horse, the hem of her dress brushing against sage and thorn, her eyes fixed on the ground as though she could will herself into the earth. Neither spoke, but each step carried the weight of unspoken words. The night they had shared was not born of choice, and now the prairie itself seemed to whisper their fate louder than either of them dared. The cowboy's life had been marked by hardship, and he had long believed he owed nothing to anyone. The frontier taught men to survive, not to linger over feelings or promises. Yet he knew the way the townsfolk would see it. He had sheltered her through the night, and that was enough to bind their lives together. Out here, where honor was currency, there was no escaping that. Still, part of him wanted to resist. The thought of being tied down, of losing the only freedom he had ever clung to, pressed heavy against his chest. He told himself he was angry at the circumstances, at the whispers that would meet them once they reached town. But as his gaze slid back to her, her weary steps, her hands clasped tight as though holding herself together, he realized the anger was not as simple as he wanted it to be. She, too, was caught in a storm she had never asked for. Raised far from the harsh rules of the Wild West, she had believed life followed order. Families chose marriages, not chance. Vows were given freely, not stolen by circumstance. Her journey west had not been meant for this. She had been promised safety, perhaps a new life in a land that held opportunity. Yet here she was, walking toward a future that felt like a cage. The idea of being called a bride, of being claimed by a man she hardly knew, made her stomach twist with fear. Here, she had heard stories of cowboys, hard men, dangerous men, men who lived by no law but their own. And though he had protected her that night, she could not shake the thought that his protection was only temporary, that his kindness might turn as quickly as the desert wind. As the town's outline grew nearer, she remembered the faces of the women she had passed on her journey, their eyes, always watching, always judging. Here, reputation was everything. A single glance could ruin a life. She already knew what they would see when she entered town at his side. They would not see her fear or her innocence. They would see only a woman who had spent the night in a cowboy's arms. That truth, whether spoken or not, was enough to decide her fate in their eyes. The cowboy kept his silence, though his thoughts churned. He thought of the saloon doors that swung open at dusk, poker tables and whiskey glasses, of the freedom he had guarded so fiercely. He thought of the times he had ridden alone under the stars, no one to answer to but himself. And now, the idea of being tied to a woman he barely knew unsettled him more than any outlaw's pistol. He wondered if she could survive the hardships of this life. Could she withstand the long nights, the hunger, the dangers that crept without warning? He doubted it, yet the image of her pressed close against him the night before kept returning to his mind. Her fear had been real, but so too had the trust she placed in him, even if only for that moment. And trust was a rare thing in his world. They entered town just as the church bell rang. The sound carried over the wooden storefronts, across the dirt street lined with wagons and horses. People turned, eyes drawn to the sight of them. Whispers began at once, quick and sharp, carried from one voice to the next. Men leaned against posts, hats tilted low, watching with curiosity. Women peered from windows or paused at water pumps, their expressions tightening. The cowboy felt the weight of every stare, though he kept his gaze fixed forward. She, however, could not lift her head. Shame burned in her cheeks as the whispers grew, words she could not quite catch but felt all the same. They stopped outside the sheriff's office, where the law met tradition, and both could be just as unforgiving. The sheriff himself stepped out, adjusting his hat against the glare of the sun. His eyes, sharp and weathered, lingered on the sight of her standing close to the cowboy's horse. He did not ask questions. He did not need to. The truth, or what the town would decide as truth, was already plain enough. "You've brought yourself a bride, it seems," the sheriff said slowly, his tone carrying more judgment than welcome. The cowboy's jaw tightened, but he did not answer. The sheriff's gaze moved to her, and she felt her knees weaken under the weight of it. In that single look, she understood what the town had already decided. There would be no arguing, no pleading her case. Her silence, her very presence, spoke louder than any defense she might give. She wanted to shout that she had never chosen this, that she had only sought protection for a single night. But the words would mean nothing here. Out here, a woman's reputation was fragile as glass, and once cracked, it could never be mended. The sheriff's expression softened only slightly as he tipped his hat toward her. "Best you both head to the preacher," he said, "before more talk spreads." The cowboy gave a curt nod, though his hands clenched around the reins. He wanted to protest, to tell the sheriff this was not how it should be, but he knew better. To fight against the judgment of the town was to invite ruin. He could ride away, yes. He could leave her standing here to face the whispers alone. But deep down, he knew he would not. Something about the way she stood there, trembling yet unbroken, rooted him in place. He had never turned his back on someone in need before, and he would not start now. She followed him in silence, her heart pounding louder than the sound of their footsteps. Every door, every window they passed, seemed to watch them. The saloon's piano stilled as their shadows crossed the threshold, and the blacksmith paused mid-strike at his forge. It was as though the entire town had turned its gaze upon them, weighing and judging their every move. She felt trapped, cornered by a world that would never listen to her truth, and yet a small part of her clung to a fragile hope that somewhere in this tangled mess there might still be a way to hold on to her own strength. As they approached the small wooden church at the far end of town, her breath caught. The preacher stood on the steps, his thin frame framed by the rising sun. His eyes widened at their approach, but he said nothing. The cowboy slowed, his steps heavy as though every board beneath him carried the weight of chains. Neither of them spoke as they stood before the preacher. The silence stretched, long and uneasy, until the preacher finally cleared his throat. "I reckon you know why you've come," he said softly, though the words fell like stones in the air. The cowboy's gaze flicked to her then, just for a moment. She met his eyes, and in that brief exchange, more was said than words could ever carry. Fear, anger, uncertainty, and something else, something unspoken, fragile, and dangerous. Before either of them could speak, the sound of hooves thundered in the distance. Dust rose at the edge of town, and all heads turned toward the riders approaching fast. Their silhouettes cut sharp against the sun, and even from afar, The tension they carried was unmistakable. Trouble was coming, and with it, perhaps a chance to delay the fate pressing down on them both. The preacher's words faltered, the townsfolk stirred, and she felt her heart leap in both fear and relief. Whatever those riders brought, it would change everything, whether for better or worse. She did not yet know. But for now, the decision hanging heavy between her and the cowboy was left suspended. Waiting for the storm to break, the riders swept into town like a storm, their horses kicking up dust that hung heavy in the morning light. Every man in sight stiffened, and even the preacher paused on the church steps, his eyes narrowing with unease. The town had seen trouble before, but the way these strangers rode carried a kind of weight that was hard to ignore. Their faces were hard, sunburned and scarred, their eyes scanning everything and everyone with a hunger that was not friendly. At their head was a man dressed in a black coat, long and dust-streaked, his hat pulled low. He had the air of someone who owned whatever ground his boots touched. The cowboy tensed the moment he saw them. He knew men like these. He had dealt with their kind on the trails, in saloons, and across poker tables that ended with drawn guns instead of coin. They were drifters, outlaws maybe, men who thrived on towns that lacked the strength to fight back. And now, with half the town's attention already caught on him and the woman by his side, he felt the ground tilt in a way he didn't like. She, standing close to him, could feel the shift in the air. Whispers darted around the edges of the crowd. Fear spread quickly, especially among the women who clutched their children tighter. She didn't know who these men were, but she understood enough to sense danger. Her breath quickened, and though she wanted to step back, she found herself closer to the cowboy instead. It was instinct, not choice, but she knew that whatever storm was about to break, he was the only shield she had. The sheriff moved forward, his hand resting near his holster, though his face betrayed a flicker of doubt. "Town's quiet," he said firmly, his voice carrying the authority of his badge. "If you're looking for trouble, you won't find it here." The man in black smiled faintly, though it held no warmth. His gaze slid over the sheriff, then toward the cowboy and the woman beside him. He tilted his head, studying them with slow calculation, as though they were the answer to a question he hadn't yet asked. "Quiet towns," he finally said, his voice low, "have a way of hiding noise." The cowboy's jaw clenched. He could feel the man's eyes digging into them, and he knew right away this wasn't coincidence. The stranger had noticed the tension, the whispers already circling about a cowboy and an unwilling bride. In the Wild West, rumors were as good as currency, and men like this could spend them in ways that ruined lives. The preacher stepped down from the church steps, his voice steady, though his hands trembled slightly. "This is a house of God," he said.
Oh.
"There's no place for violence here." But the man in black only tipped his hat, his eyes never leaving the pair standing before him. "House of God," he said slowly, "or house of judgment." His gaze lingered on her, making her stiffen, and then slid back to the cowboy. "Looks to me like you've got yourself tied up in something worth talking about." The tension deepened. The townsfolk waited, unsure whether to retreat or stay, caught between fear and curiosity. The cowboy finally spoke, his voice even, but edged with warning. "Whatever you're looking for, it ain't here." The man in black's smile widened, though his eyes stayed cold. "We'll see." With that, he signaled his men, and they dismounted, their boots hitting the ground heavy. They moved with the ease of men who knew they could take what they wanted. The sheriff squared his shoulders, but the weight of numbers was clear. This town was small, its law fragile. If these men pressed, there would be little anyone could do. She felt her pulse racing, her hands clutching at the folds of her dress. Everything was spinning faster than she could make sense of. Only hours ago, her greatest fear had been the weight of a forced marriage. Now, with outlaws standing before them, the stakes had shifted in ways she could not grasp. Yet the truth was clear whether she wished it or not. Her fate was bound tighter to the cowboy than ever before. As the strangers spread across town, the preacher quietly urged the townsfolk inside. Doors closed, windows shuttered, but eyes still peeked out, watching. The sheriff, outnumbered, did not draw his weapon, though his hand never strayed far from it. The cowboy stood firm, the woman at his side, both unwilling and unable to leave. The man in black spoke again, his words cutting through the silence. "A town like this," he said, "it thrives on secrets. And secrets have a way of coming out when the right pressure's applied." He looked again at the cowboy, and then at her. Reckon there's a secret sittin' right in front of us. She swallowed hard, the blood draining from her face. She could feel the weight of everyone's eyes, not just the strangers, but the hidden gazes of the town. The rumors, the whispers, the truth that had been shaped for them, whether they accepted it or not, it was all there, waiting to be twisted into something even worse. The cowboy stepped forward, his voice calm but steady as iron. "You've said your piece," he told the man in black. "Now leave." The man chuckled softly, shaking his head. "You don't push me off that easy, cowboy. Not when I see something worth staying for." It was clear then, this wasn't about chance. These men wanted more than a quiet town to stir. They wanted control. What better way to seize control than to take hold of a story already tangled with scandal? She realized with horror that she was no longer just a woman caught between honor and circumstance. She was a pawn in a game she didn't understand, and these men would use her to strike at the cowboy, at the town, at anyone who dared stand in their way. The tension grew heavier with each passing moment. The townsfolk, hidden yet watching, would remember every word. The sheriff, outnumbered, could not protect them all. The preacher, though his faith was strong, could not shield them from men who thrived on fear. And the cowboy, though steady, carried on his shoulders a burden growing heavier by the second. She wanted to scream, to protest, to tell them all that she was not what they thought she was. But the words caught in her throat. Out here, the truth was not what was spoken, but what people believed. And the people already believed she belonged to the cowboy, whether either of them wanted it or not. As the day wore on, the strangers settled in like snakes coiled in the grass, watching, waiting. The man in black lingered near the saloon, his men spreading through the town like a shadow creeping across the land. The sheriff stayed close, but even he knew his badge held little weight against a dozen hardened guns. The cowboy led her away from the crowd, down a side street where the noise of boots and voices faded into the hum of the prairie. She walked stiffly beside him, her mind a storm. When they finally stopped, he turned to her, his eyes hard yet troubled. "You see what's happening, don't you?" he asked. She nodded, though her voice trembled when she answered. "They'll use me. They'll use us." His jaw tightened, and he looked away, scanning the horizon as though searching for an escape. But there was none. He had been in fights before, seen towns broken by men like these, knew how quickly fear spread, how easily power shifted. And now, with the whole town already questioning their bond, the strangers had found their wedge. The night would bring no peace. The townsfolk would whisper behind doors, the strangers would drink and gamble in the saloon, and the sheriff would pace the dirt street waiting for the first spark of violence. She, lying awake, would feel every beat of her heart as though it were a clock counting down. And the cowboy, though he would not admit it, would feel the same. The conflict was no longer just between them, between an unwilling bride and a reluctant cowboy. It had spread outward, drawing in the town, the strangers, the law, and the land itself. And though neither of them could see the end, they both knew one truth. The Wild West did not forgive weakness. And whatever choice they made next would either bind them tighter or break them beyond repair. Night fell heavy over the town, shadows pooling thick between the buildings and silence pressing in from the open plains. The lamps along the main street flickered weakly, their glow unable to push back the darkness that seemed to settle with purpose. The saloon was alive, though, voices rough and laughter sharp, the strangers drinking deep and gambling loud. Every clink of glass, every shout, was a reminder that trouble had made itself at home. The townsfolk stayed locked inside, blinds drawn, whispers low. Fear had spread like wildfire, and no one dared move against the men who had arrived that morning. The sheriff walked the street with measured steps, his hand never far from his holster. But even he knew he could not face them alone. He glanced often toward the church at the far end of town, where the preacher prayed longer than usual, his voice drifting faint through the night air. Some clung to faith, others to the sheriff's badge, but deep down, everyone knew the balance of power had shifted. The strangers were in control now. The cowboy stood at the edge of town, leaning against a post, his hat pulled low. His horse grazed quietly nearby, though even the animals seemed restless. His eyes never stopped scanning the saloon, watching the doors swing as men moved in and out. He knew the type of trouble brewing inside, greed mixed with whiskey, pride sharpened by cards and coin. It was a recipe that ended only one way, and he also knew they were waiting for him. Men like those did not come to a small town without a plan. They had seen the whispers, the tension around him, and the woman beside him, and they would use it. She sat on the steps of the small boarding house where they'd been offered a room. Her hands rested in her lap, but they twisted against each other every few moments. She could hear the saloon from where she sat, every laugh like a knife cutting deeper into her unease. She had been quiet most of the day, but her thoughts churned endlessly. She had never asked for this life, never wanted the weight of being caught between a cowboy's reputation and a town's judgment. And now, with outlaws circling like vultures, she felt her own choices shrinking to nothing. When the cowboy finally returned to her, she lifted her eyes, searching his face for something solid. But what she found there was a mix of exhaustion and fire. He sat beside her, his boots crunching against the dirt, and for a moment neither spoke. The silence was thick, broken only by the sound of the saloon in the distance. "They'll test me tonight," he said finally, his voice low. She swallowed, her throat tight. "Test you how? Cards? Drink? A fight, maybe? Men like that, they want to see who breaks first. And they've already chosen me." He turned his gaze toward her, the weight of it steady. "And you," her chest tightened, the truth of it cutting through her. "Why me?" she whispered. "Because they know you're the piece that ties me down. They see it. The town sees it." Even if we never said the words, his jaw worked as though he hated to admit it. "Well, that makes you leverage." The word made her shiver. Leverage. She was no longer simply a woman caught in whispers of scandal. She was a tool in a game of power, and that thought terrified her more than anything else. The hours dragged as night deepened. The cowboy finally rose, brushing dust from his coat. "I have to face them," he said. "If I don't, they'll own this town by dawn." Her heart leapt to her throat. "Then don't go." He paused, looking at her. "If I don't, it'll be worse. They'll keep pushing, keep using you. They'll break this place piece by piece, and I won't let that happen." She wanted to argue, to tell him he was only one man against many, but the look in his eyes stopped her. He had made his choice long ago, even before she had met him. The cowboy had lived his whole life standing against storms, and this one would be no different. Still, as he walked toward the saloon, she felt a fear deeper than any she had known. The saloon doors swung wide, and the noise inside stilled just slightly when he entered. The strangers looked up, their leader sitting at the card table near the back, his black coat draped over the chair like a shadow. He smiled thinly as the cowboy approached. "Knew you'd come," the man in black said. "Man like you can't stay away when eyes are watching." The cowboy didn't answer at first, just pulled out a chair and sat. The room held its breath as the cards were dealt, whiskey poured, and the game began. The stakes rose with each hand, not just in coin, but in the way every glance circled back to him. Men laughed, cursed, drank, but under it all was a coil of tension, waiting for the spark. Outside, she sat frozen on the boarding house steps, staring at the saloon as if she could will its walls transparent. Every shout inside made her flinch, every laugh made her skin prickle. She felt trapped between running and waiting, but either way her fate was tied to whatever happened in that room. She thought of the preacher's prayers, of the sheriff's silent patrol, of the townsfolk huddled in fear. But mostly, she thought of the cowboy at that table, alone against men who carried shadows in their eyes. Inside, the game dragged on until the air grew thick. Coins clinked against the wood, whiskey spilled, and the man in black leaned forward, his grin sharp. "Seems to me, cowboy, that luck's riding with you tonight. But luck don't last forever." The cowboy met his gaze without flinching, neither does fear. The words hung sharp in the air. Chairs shifted, hands brushed against holsters. The saloon seemed to hold its breath. The man in black chuckled low, though his eyes burned cold. "Then maybe we ought to raise the stakes." He leaned back, his gaze sliding toward the door, as though he knew exactly who sat waiting outside. "Let's see just how much you'll risk for that woman of yours." The cowboy's hand tightened around his cards, though his face stayed still. He had expected this, but the sound of her name, though unspoken, brought a weight heavier than any coin on the table. The saloon doors creaked as the wind pushed them, and for a moment silence filled the room. Every man there knew something was about to break. Whether it would be cards, fists, or bullets, no one could say. But the tension was thick enough to taste. And it pressed on every soul in that building and everyone hiding behind shuttered windows outside. Back at the boarding house, she rose to her feet, unable to sit still any longer. Fear clawed at her chest, but so did something else, an ache she couldn't name. She wanted to run, to leave town and never look back. Yet her feet carried her toward the saloon instead. Every step felt heavier, every sound louder, until she stood at the edge of the street, her heart pounding. Through the window, she saw him at the table, his hat shadowing his face, the men around him tense as drawn bows. She could not hear their words, but she could feel the danger pulsing through the glass. And she knew with a certainty that chilled her blood that whatever happened next would decide everything, not just for him, not just for her, but for the whole town caught in the storm. The cowboy set his cards down, his eyes fixed on the man in black. The air was thick, the room taut as a trigger pulled halfway. Outside, she pressed a hand to the window frame, her breath fogging the glass. The sheriff's shadow moved at the edge of the street, one hand resting heavy on his gun, the other clenched in a fist. The moment stretched long, like the pause before lightning strikes. The strangers leaned forward, their eyes sharp and waiting. The townsfolk held their breath behind closed doors. And in that tense silence, the Wild West itself seemed to lean closer, ready to witness the clash that would shape not only two unwilling souls, but the fate of an entire town. Then the man in black spoke, slow and deliberate. "Let's see how far you'll go, cowboy. See what you're truly willing to lose." The room went still, every hand hovering near steel, every gaze fixed on the two men staring across the table. She pressed tighter against the glass, her chest aching with fear, knowing the next breath, the next move, would ignite the fire that had been building since dawn. The saloon was so quiet that the tick of the clock on the wall seemed louder than the wind outside. All eyes were locked on the cowboy and the man in black. Cards sat untouched on the table, glasses half drained, guns close enough to reach with one motion. The man in black leaned forward, his smile cold, and tapped the edge of his glass. "So what's it going to be, cowboy? You play this hand and win, or you walk away and let us take what we want? The town, the girl, all of it." The cowboy met his gaze, steady as stone. His hand didn't move for his gun, nor for his cards. He simply leaned back, the chair creaking under his weight. "We've already lost," he said calmly. The room tensed. A few of the outlaws shifted in their seats, hands twitching toward holsters, but the man in black's smile only widened. Big words from a man sitting outnumbered. The cowboy finally pushed his cards forward, face up. It wasn't about the hand, it was about the choice. You think you've got the upper hand because you brought numbers, but you've underestimated one thing. This town may be scared, but they won't let you burn it down, not while I'm standing here. A murmur stirred from outside. Townsfolk who had been peeking through shutters now stepped closer, drawn by his voice. The sheriff shifted, hand still on his gun, but his back straightened a little. And the preacher, who had followed at a distance, whispered a prayer before stepping boldly onto the boardwalk. The man in black's eyes flickered, just for a moment, as though he hadn't expected resistance. He gestured lazily to one of his men, who rose with a sneer, gun glinting under the lamp. But before the outlaw could draw, the sheriff stepped forward. His revolver cleared leather faster than the eye could follow, and the barrel pointed straight at the man's chest. "Not tonight," the sheriff said, his voice hard. The tension snapped. Chairs screeched, guns came up, and the saloon exploded into chaos. Shots cracked, smoke filled the air, and the wooden walls shook with the sound of violence. The cowboy moved like lightning, flipping the table and using it as cover as bullets tore through the room. He returned fire, his aim true, dropping one of the outlaws before he even had time to fire twice. "Outside," she cried out as the noise ripped through the night. Instinct told her to run, but something deeper kept her rooted. She couldn't abandon him, not now. Clutching the edge of the saloon door, she prayed he'd come out alive. Inside, the fight raged. The preacher dragged one wounded man to safety. The sheriff held his ground by the door, and the townsfolk, emboldened by the chaos, began to act. A shopkeeper armed with a hunting rifle fired from the balcony, sending one of the strangers sprawling. Another man swung a chair into the back of an outlaw, knocking him into the bar. The tide was shifting. But the man in black remained calm, his gun steady, his eyes fixed on the cowboy. He waited for the smoke to clear, then stepped forward, his voice cutting through the noise. "Face me," he demanded. The cowboy rose from behind the table, dust and splinters clinging to his coat. Their eyes locked, the room fading around them. Two men, shaped by the same unforgiving land, standing toe-to-toe with nothing left between them but will. The man in black fired first, but the cowboy was faster. His bullet struck true, spinning the outlaw leader backward, his coat whipping as he crashed to the floor. The room stilled. The remaining outlaws froze, their leaders fall, draining the fight from them. One by one, they dropped their weapons, raising their hands in surrender. Silence filled the saloon, broken only by the crackle of lamps and the shallow breaths of men who had stared death in the eye. The sheriff lowered his gun, sweat on his brow, but relief in his eyes. The townsfolk emerged from hiding, their courage swelling now that the danger had passed. She rushed into the saloon, her eyes scanning until they found him. He stood in the haze of gun smoke, shoulders heavy but alive. When she reached him, she didn't speak. She simply looked at him, her fear giving way to something harder to name. Gratitude, relief, and maybe the beginning of trust. The preacher stepped forward, his voice firm. "This town stands because of him. Shh, don't forget it." His words carried through the crowd and heads nodded in agreement. The cowboy, though, only looked at the floor, weary. He hadn't fought for thanks. He'd fought because there was no other way. The sheriff gathered the captured outlaws, already planning to send word for the marshal. The townsfolk began cleaning the wreckage, voices louder now, carrying a strength they hadn't shown in years. And through it all, she stayed close to the cowboy, as though afraid he might vanish if she let go. When the dust settled and the night grew quiet again, they stepped outside together. The stars above burned clear, and the prairie stretched endless, carrying the scent of smoke and iron. She finally broke the silence. "Why did you stay? You could have left me. Left all of this." He didn't answer right away. His gaze swept the horizon, as though searching for words in the sky. At last he said, "Because walking away don't always mean freedom. Sometimes it means losing the part of yourself worth keeping." Her chest tightened at the weight of his words. She had thought of him only as a man chained by the town's judgment, bound against his will. But maybe he too had found himself caught in something deeper, something that forced him to choose more than the open trail. In the days that followed, the town began to heal. The strangers were hauled away, the saloon patched, the streets alive again with cautious laughter. The story of the gunfight spread quickly, told and retold until the details blurred into legend. The cowboy was no longer just a drifter passing through. He was the man who had stood when no one else could. And she, though her role had begun in whispers of scandal, was now seen with different eyes. It's no longer a burden, but part of the story that saved the town. Yet in the quiet moments, when the crowd's voices faded, she and the cowboy still faced the truth of what had bound them together. They had not chosen it. The night that had forced her to lean against his chest had set them on a path neither had asked for. Somewhere along that path, between fear and fire, they had found a kind of strength in each other. One evening, as the sun bled across the horizon, she stood beside him on the edge of town. The land stretched wide and endless, the trail calling as it always had. He looked at her, his face unreadable, and asked softly, "If I ride on, what happens to you?" She met his gaze, steady now, her voice stronger than it had been. "Then I'll make my own way. But if you stay," she hesitated, the words catching. "If you stay, maybe we both find something worth more than freedom." He didn't answer right away. The wind stirred, carrying the sound of children playing in the street behind them, the hammer of the blacksmith, the faint hymn of the preacher. The town was alive because they had stood together, though the trail would always call to him for the first time in years. The cowboy wondered if he had already found what he'd been riding toward all along. The choice lingered between them, not spoken, but heavy with possibility. He placed a hand gently on her shoulder, his eyes softer than she had ever seen. "We'll see," he said. And though it wasn't a promise, it was enough. The sun dipped low, the prairie glowing gold, and the town behind them hummed with life. Their story, born of accident and forged in fire, had not ended in ruin as many feared. Instead, it had become a tale of survival, of unlikely strength, and of two souls learning that sometimes the Wild West gave not just hardship, but the chance for something greater. And as the stars came out one by one, they stood together on the edge of the land, their past behind them, their future unwritten, but their bond no longer a chain. It was choice, it was hope, and in the heart of the Wild West, it was enough.